For both flexion and extension, the axis of the goniometer should be aligned to the lateral aspect of the greater tubercle of the humerus. The proximal arm should be parallel to the mid-axillary line of the thorax, while the distal arm should be aligned with the lateral midline of the humerus, using the lateral epicondyle or olecranon process as reference. The end feel should be firm, but the normal value for flexion is normally 180 degrees, while the normal value for extension is 60 degrees. The testing position for flexion is in supine, while the testing position for extension is in prone. For abduction, the axis of the goniometer should be aligned with the anterior aspect of the acromial process. The proximal arm should be parallel to the midline of the anterior aspect of the sternum, while the distal arm should be aligned with the anterior midline of the humerus, using the medial epicondyle as reference. The end feel should be firm, and the normal value should be 180 degrees. Adduction is not usually measured because it is the return to 0 degrees starting position from full abduction. For lateral and medial rotation, the axis of the goniometer should be aligned with the olecranon process of the ulna. The proximal arm should either be parallel or perpendicular to the floor, and the distal arm should be aligned with the ulna using the olecranon process and ulnar styloid process for reference. The end feel for both motion is firm, and the normal range of motion for lateral rotation is 90, while the normal range of motion for medial rotation is 70. For flexion and extension of the elbow, the axis of the goniometer should be placed at the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. The proximal arm should be placed at the lateral midline of the humerus, using the center of the acromion process as reference. The distal arm should be placed at the lateral midline of the radius, with reference to the radial head and radial styloid process. The end feel for flexion is either soft, firm, or hard, and the normal value for this is 150 degrees. The end feel for extension is hard or firm, and its normal range of motion value is 0 degrees. Both motions are tested in supine. For pronation, the axis of the goniometer should be placed lateral and proximal to the ulnar styloid process. The proximal arm should be parallel to the anterior midline of the humerus, while the distal arm should be placed on the dorsal aspect of the forearm, proximal and parallel to the styloid processes of radius and ulna. The end feel is hard or firm, and the normal value for the range of motion is 80 degrees. For supination, the axis of the goniometer should be placed medial and proximal to the ulnar styloid process. The proximal arm is parallel to the anterior midline of the humerus, while the distal arm should be placed at the ventral aspect of the forearm, proximal and parallel to the styloid processes of radius and ulna. The end feel is firm, and the normal range of motion is 80 degrees.
For wrist flexion, extension, radial and ulnar deviation, the patient is seated with the shoulder abducted to 90 degrees and the elbow flexed to 90 degrees. The palm is facing the ground. The radius and the ulnar are stabilized to prevent supination and pronation of the forearm and motion of the elbow. For wrist flexion and extension, the axis is placed on the lateral aspect of the wrist over the triquetrum. The proximal arm is aligned to the lateral midline of the ulna, with reference to the olecranon and ulnar styloid process. The distal arm is aligned with the lateral midline of the fifth metacarpal. The end feel for both flexion and extension of the wrist are firm, with a normal value of flexion of 80 degrees and extension of 70 degrees. For wrist radial and ulnar deviation, the axis is placed on the dorsal aspect of the wrist over the capitate. The proximal arm is aligned on the dorsal midline of the forearm, with reference to the lateral epicondyle. The distal arm is aligned with the dorsal midline of the third metacarpal. The end feel for both radial and ulnar deviation of the wrist is hard or firm, with a normal value of 20 degrees for radial deviation and 30 degrees for ulnar deviation. For all movements of the wrist, the patient is seated with the shoulder abducted to 90 degrees and the elbow flexed to 90 degrees. For the CMC joint of the thumb, flexion and extension, the axis is placed on the palmar aspect of the first CMC joint. The proximal arm is aligned on the ventral midline of the radius using the ventral surface of the radial head and styloid process for reference. The distal arm is aligned on the ventral midline of the first metacarpal. The end feel for both flexion and extension of the CMC joint of the thumb is firm, with a normal value 15 degrees for flexion and 20 or 80 degrees for extension. For abduction of the CMC joint of the thumb, the axis is placed on the lateral aspect of the radial styloid process and the proximal arm aligned on the lateral midline of the second metacarpal with reference to the center of the second MCP joint. The distal arm is aligned to the lateral midline of the first metacarpal using the center of the first MCP joint for reference. The end feel is firm with a value of 70 degrees. For opposition, use a ruler to measure the distance between the tip of the thumb and proximal digit crease of the little finger or at the MCP joint. The end feel is soft or firm. For flexion and extension of the MCP of the thumb, the axis is placed on the dorsal aspect of the MCP joint, with the proximal arm aligned on the dorsal midline of the metacarpal and the distal arm aligned on the dorsal midline of the proximal phalanx. The end feel for both flexion and extension is firm, with a normal value of 50 degrees for flexion and 0 degrees for extension. Flexion and extension of the IP joint of the thumb, the axis is placed on the dorsal surface of the IP joint, with the proximal arm aligned on the dorsal midline of the proximal phalanx and the distal arm aligned on the dorsal midline of the distal phalanx. The end feel for both flexion and extension is firm, with a normal value of 80 degrees for flexion and 20 degrees for extension. For flexion, extension, and abduction of the MCP joint of the fingers, the axis is placed on the dorsal aspect of the MCP joint, with the proximal arm aligned on the dorsal midline of the metacarpal and the distal arm aligned on the dorsal midline of the proximal phalanx. The end feel for flexion, extension, and abduction is firm, with a normal value of 90 degrees for flexion, 45 degrees for extension, and 90 degrees for abduction. MCP abduction is not usually recorded because it is the return from full abduction to the 0 degree starting position. For PIP flexion and extension, the axis is placed on the dorsal aspect of the PIP joint, with the proximal arm aligned to the dorsal midline of the proximal phalanx and the distal arm aligned on the dorsal midline of the middle phalanx. The end feel is usually hard,